We have to empower the grassroots. We have to empower citizens, if you like, give them the tools to be able to argue the case. And to this, coming back to this point about raising expectations and raising political consciousness. I mean, as Henry Ford once said, that if people understood the banking and monetary system, there'd be a revolution before tomorrow morning. This is such a kind of an empowering proposition. And, MMT is the key to that, in my view. It's kind of revolutionary.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, politician and tireless social and economic justice campaigner, Chris Williamson. And we're going to be talking to him in a moment about his latest project, The Festival of Resistance, and how modern monetary theory has changed his thinking about public policy. So why is an understanding of modern money so important when it comes to understanding politics? Well, as the excellent comedian Glenn Wool puts it, if newspapers were really designed to help you understand the world, the business section would be at the front of the newspaper and the rest of the newspaper would be called the consequences. Money as a system is one of the most potent political forces affecting our lives, but we don't really question why that is or how we got here. Money just is and always has been. As the proverb goes, fish discover water last. We're so busy working to get these pieces of paper with monarchs or dead presidents printed on them that we don't have time to figure out what distinguishes them from all the other bits of paper in the world. So here's a jumping off point for you to consider. If you live in a country with a modern money system, that is to say, you have a currency issuing government, like, say, the UK, the US, Japan, Canada, or Australia, to name a few, your government spends money into existence using computer keystrokes. This is not controversial. Central bankers say it out loud. The Bank of England put out a study in 2014 called Money Creation in the Modern Economy, which confirms this is how it works. Your government spends by passing a budget, and once the new spending is approved by Parliament or Congress, government instructs its central bank to credit the bank accounts of the recipients of the new spending using computer keystrokes. New dollars, pounds, or yen are spent into existence every time a monetarily sovereign government spends. The money is not collected from billionaires or borrowed from your adult grandchildren in the future and sent back in time, and no gold coins are hammered into the internet to make those bank balances go up. So what does that mean for workers and these pieces of paper we all have to work for? Can we now refuse to work for them now that we know where they come from? No, because that's the primary purpose of taxes, to drive currency from inception. The state, democratic or otherwise, desires to provision itself with roads and bridges and soldiers and doctors and nurses and teachers and people to build the buildings that house these institutions. So it lays on a tax in a token that it alone is allowed to create. In the UK, we call these tokens pounds. And by presenting the population with tax bills or tax liabilities payable in pounds, that means individuals now have to do something to get those pounds to settle their tax obligations to the state. And that's the thing that allows the government to spend their otherwise worthless pieces of paper into existence to hire the people that it caused to be unemployed when it laid on the tax. You can listen to our first 3 episodes for more detail on how that mechanism works. But still, how does this change things for progressive activists? Don't we still have the same struggle, namely that we have a massively uneven society? Don't we need to transfer money from people who have so much of it that it's toxic to democracy and social cohesion, and put that money in the hands of people that have so little of it that it robs them of their dignity, their aspirations, and in many cases their lives? Well, now we're getting to one of the secondary functions of taxes, which is to limit the spending power of the private sector And it makes a lot of sense to target and severely limit the spending power of the wealthiest individuals for social equity purposes. But also, what we should realize is that because the government creates money when it spends, we're not fighting for a finite pool of money in order to change the situation of people struggling to survive. To put it in the framework that we all grew up with, a currency issuing government can take from the rich and give to the poor, but it doesn't need to take from the rich to give to the poor. The source and solution of the challenge for activists, as I see it, lies at the beginning of the money story, in that when the government lays on its tax in the first instance, it makes everybody unemployed by definition, i.e., everybody is looking for work that pays in pounds but can't find it. And then the government spends its money into existence to hopefully hire all the people that it unemployed. Therefore, any residual unemployment left over exists because the government has made a mistake. It either didn't spend enough to employ everybody it unemployed, or when it taxed, it took too much money out of the system to let the spending power of the private sector increase to a level that creates the number of jobs needed to give paid work to everybody that wants it. To fix that mistake, the government can either spend more or tax less or both. But even with the political will to make full employment a priority, it's impossible to target a precise number of pounds that should exist in the economy to make sure everybody has a job, because that number is a moving target. So the solution proposed by MMT economists is to have the government, the issuer of the currency, the source of the unemployment in the first place, to take responsibility for the residual unemployment it creates by offering a job to anyone willing and able to work, and have that job pay at a socially inclusive wage, with on-the-job training included where necessary. It's very important to note this is not a scheme that is designed to make people who can't or shouldn't work because of, say, disability have to go out and work for financial assistance. Those kind of benefits would still be there under this scheme, and of course with an MMT understanding of where money comes from, those benefits could and should be paid at a much higher level than they are now. The MMT Job Guarantee is a guaranteed offer of work. It's not a demand to work. It's voluntary on the part of the worker. It's an extra option designed to eliminate involuntary unemployment. And the argument that I favour that cuts through many of the objections to a job guarantee comes from Ellis Winningham, and it's that we already have a government job guarantee. As it stands in our so-called advanced economies, if you can't find a job, your government will guarantee you one, where you can organise your own workload, but the job description is to not die. And it pays below subsistence wages, so it's good for people who like a challenge. And the job title is Inflation Fighter. And it's a crucial service you'll be providing to the rest of the economy if you believe, as Conservative Chancellor Norman Lamont did, that unemployment is a price worth paying to keep inflation down. In the UK, this job is also known as being on universal credit. There's a rigorous and some would say humiliating interview process to go through, and some people die waiting to hear whether or not they've got the job. But that's the job you're entitled to at any given time in many advanced economies. The MMT Job Guarantee is designed to compete with this job. It's designed to give workers the power to turn down this job in favour of one that pays a socially inclusive wage, doing things that are of benefit to the community but not necessarily profitable for the private sector to instigate. For more detail on how the job guarantee works, you can listen to our episode 4 with Fidel Kaboub and our episode 47 with Pavlina Cheneva. Some people argue that in an age of robots and automation, a job guarantee is an old-fashioned solution to a modern problem, so-called technological unemployment. But this is not a modern phenomenon. It's called increased productivity, and it's been with us since at least the advent of the windmill. And it's not a problem in and of itself. It's the public policy response to it that turns it into a problem that typically gets shouldered by the most insecure workers in an economy. At the moment, workers displaced by increased productivity have no choice but to shift into a buffer stock of unemployed humans and have a miserable life fighting inflation, while the captains of industry figure out which new poorly paid jobs they'd like to slot people into when they're good and ready to start hiring again. So we're not suggesting to replace the toil that human ingenuity and technology has done away with the exact same toil. To me, what MMT recognizes is that the government, like it or not, sets the minimum standard of living for all the people under its aegis. What an advanced society without a job guarantee is saying is that if you can't find a job in the public or private sector, you are entitled to a below subsistence standard of living, and private sector employers, when they are ready to hire, only have to pay a little better than that to get a worker. What a society that implements the job guarantee will be saying is, if you are willing and able to work, say, a 40-hour week, this is the type of life we think a person should be entitled to. A socially inclusive wage, on-the-job training, paid leave, paid maternity leave, paid sick leave, etc. And if you think that a 40-hour week should be a thing of the past, make the job guarantee job, say, a 30-hour week for the same pay and conditions, and the private sector will have to fall in line with that. And finally, just a note on universal basic income. I personally try not to get in the way of people who are advocating UBI because I think we all want the same thing, which is a guaranteed floor put under our minimum standard of living. But that said, I'm going to raise a couple of negative points about UBI as I see it. And I say this in the interests of constructive criticism. I know there hasn't yet emerged a unified UBI proposal, so I'm aware I could be strawmanning a particular proposal someone might have in mind. And secondly, I hope we can all agree that basic income paid to people right now during the coronavirus pandemic to keep them clothed and fed and housed because they can't go to work without endangering lives, I think we can agree that kind of assistance is necessary, it's what we should be doing, but it's time limited to whenever the crisis has passed, and therefore it's conditional. And that's not universal basic income, it's basic income. So that's not what I'm criticizing here. So the first problem with UBI is that it's universal. And this framing came out of an interview Rowan Gray of the Modern Money Network gave to Steve Grunbein on Macro and Cheese. So thanks to Rowan and Steve for this. So hopefully we can agree that monetary economies have at least two types of people in them. Those that, in order to survive, need more money than they have the opportunity to earn and will spend extra money if they can earn it or if it's given to them. And then we have those that don't need extra money and very likely won't spend it if it's given to them. And we know this second group exists because not only do they have large amounts of savings that they're not spending and assets that they don't need to sell, but at the very high end, they're constantly looking for places to put their money to be tax efficient. So those people have spent all the money they're going to spend already, and they're just piling it up. So it seems to me giving that group of people more money very likely won't result in any more spending, which won't result in any more income for anybody else, and therefore no economic growth that first group of people will be able to benefit from. So let's consider these two groups of people over a 10-year timeline. If you give even a modest UBI, say $1,000 a month, to these two groups of people for 10 years, at the end of that 10-year period, the person that needed it to survive will have spent it. They will have built no wealth. At the other end of the scale, the high-income earner with savings and assets will have seen their personal wealth go up by $120,000. Over a 20-year timeline, that's the best part of $250,000. And of course, it won't end there because UBI is a permanent unconditional program. So hopefully you can see that one very valid criticism of universal basic income is that it will deepen wealth inequality. And I know that some people then like to defend UBI by talking about how their version of it comes with a tax plan to claw back the money from the already wealthy. But at that point, we're then talking about a de facto basic income scheme and not universal basic income. And as I said earlier, targeted basic income is something that I and all the MMT advocates I interact with support. But like I say, I think it should be targeted rather than universal. The second criticism of UBI is that it doesn't end involuntary unemployment. And of course, it's valid to say that it's not designed to do that, which then leads me to think, given that it deepens wealth inequality and it won't guarantee a minimum standard of living in a way that can't be provided by a basic income, what is it designed for? So I hope that helps people understand why MMT advocates who recognize the source of unemployment and all the negative effects that come with it, are apprehensive about UBI, as distinct from basic income. When you consider the climate crisis, the health crisis, and the economic crisis, you have to conclude, even though we've got iPhones in our pockets and a space force to staff, there's still plenty to do here on Earth. As our previous guest, Professor John Harvey, says, if you've got a social problem, you've got a job that needs doing. And the job guarantee helps distribute that work equitably. So, just before we dive in, Chris mentions Richard Murphy and Corbynomics. And we have a whole episode on that with Professor Murphy himself. And that's our episode number 8. And he's a great guest. Also, a big thank you to you guys for taking the time to listen and for recommending us to other people and for all the positive feedback you give. It really gives us the fuel we need to continue. And a special thank you to our patrons who are really helping us keep the lights on right now. If you're not yet a patron, support starts at $1 a month. That's 79 pence at the time of recording. And it really helps keep the show going. And you get early access to all our shows and patron-only shows and other content. There's a link to our Patreon page in the show notes. And there's also a link to where you can watch and support the work of Glenn Wool, whose joke I quoted at the beginning. So something for everybody. Okay, let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley. I'm here with Patricia Pino. Hi P, how are you doing?
Hello, not too bad. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Very excited to welcome our guest for this episode. I'm probably right in saying it's the first MMT savvy person in politics in Britain. Please welcome to the MMT podcast, Chris Williamson. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Enjoying the weather.
We'd love to start by talking about your background. How did your work in politics and organising begin?
Well, I guess I was inspired by my mum and dad, to be honest with you. My dad was never a Labour Party activist as such, but he was a trade unionist, and he was someone who was very committed to social justice. Both my mother and father were of the Second World War generation. And I remember them talking to me about coming back from the war and saying how determined they were to ensure, not just them, but obviously the whole generation of young people who'd been sent away to war, to not go back to the 1930s, to the indignity of the means test, poor quality housing, insecure employment and so on. And they were determined to deliver something better. And they said that everybody expected Winston Churchill to win that election. He was hailed as the great war leader. And I think there was a huge shock when the votes came in. And I think it was predominantly the troops vote that actually swung it for Labour with that landslide victory that secured the transformation of the country. Although looking back at it, personally, I think although it was a seminal moment in Britain, and they did put in train a post-war consensus that stood the test of time for 34 years, I think that government could and should have gone a lot further. And many of the huge changes that they brought about were a hangover from the war, really, and the need to work in a cooperative, collective manner when you are engaged in total war, as obviously Britain was at that time. And I think, for example, on things like private education, I mean, we could have abolished the public schools back then. I think that government's foreign policy left a lot to be desired as well. I think the model of nationalisation that they embraced, didn't go far enough. And you've probably heard the tales, about people like the miners who were saying, well, nothing much has changed really, other than the sign at the pit head. Obviously, there were changes. Clearly, there was huge investments in health and safety in a way that the private owners of the coal mining industry weren't interested in previously. So yes, there were changes, but I think part of the problem was that the success of that government and that post-war consensus sowed the seeds of its own demise, really, because when in 1979 Thatcher came to power and then embraced the whole neoliberal agenda and started down the road of privatization, when people like myself and others who were trying to make the case to say to people, look, we already own these utilities, we already own the railways and so on, they didn't really kind of resonate with people, because people felt, well, I didn't feel like I owned them, because they were run by remote bureaucrats. And I think that was a a huge error, really. We should have done a lot more to involve people, and we should have done a lot more, I think, to bring about a sort of transformation in the balance of wealth and power in the country, and a irreversible change in the balance of wealth and power, the kind of thing that we were committed to in 1974, in the manifesto in 1974, before Dennis Healey erroneously went to the International Monetary Fund on the basis that false basis that we were running out of money, and of course set us on the road towards a Thatcher-led government and neoliberalism and the range of other mistakes that government made in terms of not going to the country in 1978 and not actually settling with the trade unions in the winter of 78-79, which led to the so-called winter of discontent. But yeah, so I mean, a long-winded sort of answer, but no, I mean, I think it was my mum and dad's sort of inspiration, really, and what they'd been through growing up in the 1920s and 30s, and seeing living through the depression and the terrible poverty that they experienced and witnessed, and that sense that we're never going to go back to that. And I'd love to see us rediscovering that spirit of 1945 again to bring about the kind of transformation that the country desperately needs now. And, we came close in 2017, and were it not for the saboteurs inside the Parliamentary Labour Party and its bureaucracy, then, of course, I think we would have made it over the line, and we would have been now talking about the transformation of Britain and how far a Labour government should be going right now. But as things have turned out, of course, we're living with the consequences of an ideologically driven right-wing Tory government led by Boris Johnson. Or should I say Dominic Cummings?
You mentioned Dennis Healey and that whole episode of the 1970s. I think that was what you wrote for a piece on the Morning Star in relation to MMT. And I was wondering whether that kind of whole episode was the reason why you got interested in MMT, or was it looking for answers, or was it completely unrelated? How did you come across MMT?
No, it was unrelated, if I'm honest. And like many people, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but far from it now. But I think I have a better understanding now. And I think MMT is, is obviously those like people like yourself, often talk about, Bill Mitchell and others, that, MMT is just a lens to if you like, understand or have a better understanding anyway of the monetary system. And I suppose I was flailing around, looking for, ways in which a progressive, radical socialist Labour government could implement its program. And like many people, I'd been conned by the notion that somehow we needed to use the resources raised from the taxes of the rich people, the billionaires and so on. And I remember often making the argument about, how we need to, and we do obviously need to tax the billionaires, and we do need to clamp down on the tax havens, etc. But for a long time, my thinking was that's how we raise our resources. That's the way to do it. And, there's a lot to be said, obviously, for clamping down on the kind of abuses of the tax regime. I remember recording a video about the Paradise Papers. This was before I'd actually encountered MMT. And it was Stephanie Kelton, actually, not Bill Mitchell, who I first saw talking about this in a video lecture that she gave at the UCL at the invitation of Mariana Mazzucato. And for me, that was a light bulb moment. And I've kind of never looked back, really. I'm thinking, wow, this is it. This is the way in which I think a progressive socialist Labour government can, take on those myths, take on those who say that a Labour government programme to transform our public services, our economy, etc. It all sounds very nice, but it's pie in the sky and it's impossible to deliver. And clearly it isn't. Clearly it is, in fact, common sense. And I've coined a phrase about common sense socialism. And I think MMT absolutely fits into that description, really. It's all about common sense socialism and using MMT to deliver common sense socialism. And that's how I really came across MMT and why I think it's such an incredibly important and valuable tool and something that we really do need to promote as widely as we possibly can and encourage as many people as we possibly can to look at it. And, obviously we need to press the politicians, but I think we need to go considerably further than that. And one of the things that I'm working on at the moment with others is to create a new grassroots movement. And what I'm very keen to do is to spread, understanding of the monetary system and to empower and to encourage communities and to raise expectations, really, and to give people the tools, if you like, to prevent the kind of politicians and the establishments and the elites from pulling the wool over our eyes. And that's what they've been doing really since time immemorial. And, we just think we've got to, in my opinion anyway, give people that information, because knowledge is power. And that then would improve our democracy and make it easier, I think, then for people to, hold our politicians to account and hold our representative democracy to account. Because frankly, representative democracy's failed. We are the 5th biggest economy in the world at the moment by GDP. And yet we've got millions of people, 14 million people living in poverty. 1.5 million are destitute. Thousands of people sleep on our streets every single night of the year in every town and city in the land. This is an absolute scandal. There's no need for it. It's all about political will. And, it's fine having political will, but you need the mechanism, you need the tools, I think, to be able to, if you like, implement your program and to, give form to that political will. And this is where I think MMT actually fills that gap, and why it's so important, I think, that particularly for Labour, anyway, or those that profess to be, on the progressive side of politics, look at MMT as a way of, creating the good society that a lot of people profess to say that they want to bring about.
And did the penny drop immediately, or was it more of a...
Oh, my goodness me. It was kind of, yeah, absolutely. It was like a light bulb moment, I watched it several times, actually, and I've showed it to so many people as well. And because I think Stephanie is an incredible, raconteur. She's very engaging, as is Bill, but I'd not come across Bill at that point in time. And, she explained the concept, as it were, in a very accessible way. And for somebody like me, coming from a working class background, it kind of worked for me anyway, and I thought, well, if I can understand it or have some understanding of it anyway, as I say, I wouldn't profess to be an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do understand, I do get the concept. And as I say, I think if I can get it, anybody can get it. And, it gives a lie to, the whole kind of sociological thing about the conspiracy of the professionals. There's a lot of gobbledygook spoken about. I remember before New Labour came to power, and well, it was Ed Balls, I think, who advised Gordon Brown along these lines. But he made a speech in the House where he was talking about neoclassical endogenous growth theory, which, I think to a lot of people looking in think, what in God's name is he on about? And even the Tories kind of fell about laughing. I mean, I'm sure many of them, or maybe they did, I don't know. But they sort of ridiculed him and said he was talking in sort of gobbledygook in that sense. And I think the thing about MMT is it's an easy concept to get your head around, really, and that's why I think the more advocates we can create, and the more we can get people up and down the country to champion this idea, I think the more people will buy into it, and the greater the possibility then to bring about the change that this country desperately needs.
We touched on it briefly a few beats ago. You're the founder of the Festival of Resistance. Is that the name of the Grassroots Movement, or just the website? That's the first part of it. And then the second part of my question is, the site says that you are pushing for participatory rather than representative democracy, to give citizens a real influence over those in authority. Can you tell the listeners about the difference between those two types of democratic process?
Yeah, I mean, it is the Festival of Resistance, and we're planning to formally launch in June, but of course the pandemic has put paid to that. We put it back to the autumn, but because it's looking likely that the social distancing rules will be in place until the end of the year, we've now put it back, the formal launch, that is, the physical launch, until the new year now. And I think the new date is the weekend of the 15th of May. So yes, I mean, that's so at the moment, we're trying to kind of build an online presence. One of the things that we want to do with the movement is to ensure that it isn't just simply focused on the UK, but that it's a very much an internationalist, anti-imperialist movement as well, and that we want to, if we can, build links with liberation struggles, with social movements and progressive movements around the world. And we believe that we have a lot more in common with working class people in different countries than we do with the elites in Great Britain. And I think that notion that Marx talked about, the workers of the world to unite, is something that I think is really important. And with the advent of new technology, the kind of technology that we're using today, I think it makes it a bit easier now for us to bring that to fruition. And so that's something that we're very keen to do. And also, I think it's important just to stem the rising fascist tide that we're sadly seeing in this country and indeed across Europe and elsewhere in the world. And I think it's important, therefore, that, we do express that sort of international solidarity. And as I've said, use the advent of new technology to make that a bit easier to bring about. The point, though, about representative democracy and participatory democracy is that my concern, as I was saying earlier on, that representative democracy hasn't really worked. I mean, if it did, we wouldn't have the level of inequality and poverty that I mentioned. And I just wonder, in the end, who are many of these representatives, so-called, actually representing? It seems to me that they are doing more to represent the interests of the corporate world and the elites in society than they are for the constituents that actually put them there. And I think, having been in Westminster myself, there is, people talk about this Westminster Bubble phenomenon, and it does genuinely exist. I think people, particularly those representing safe seats, they get very comfortable. And the lobbyists get to work and, with the flattery and all the rest of it. And, it can have a kind of insidious impact. And people, lose touch. That's one of the reasons why I was very keen on advocating greater democracy inside the Labour Party. This is what actually put paid to my membership of the party, because there were very powerful forces inside the parliamentary Labour Party and the bureaucracy that didn't want that at any price because it threatened their power base. And so what I was talking about essentially was participatory democracy inside the Labour Party. And rather than the policy-making process being deferred to these policy forums, and in reality, policy tends to be driven by the parliamentary Labour Party and the leadership. And I wanted to see us putting grassroots members in the driving seat and giving them the opportunity to drive the party's policy. And I think actually party members, grassroots members, are far more in touch with reality on the ground. And somehow, inside the Labour Party, anyway, inside the parliamentary Labour Party, there seems to be this view abroad that when you get into Parliament, that somehow you are a cut above the rest and that you have some sort of special powers. Well, having worked with these characters, I know that's absolutely not the case. And we would be far better placed, I think, as a political party. I keep saying we. I'm not a member of the Labour Party anymore, but I was a member for 44 years. So it's hard to get out of the habit of referring to we when I'm talking about the party. But I think the party would be in a far better place if members were given the opportunity to determine policy, were given the opportunity to select who they want to be their candidates at every election. This is something which is normal practice in every other democracy that I've looked at around the world, where a elected official doesn't have a job for life. They have to go through an endorsement process. Giving members a head in that way to help devise policy, because grassroots members live in the constituency and work in the constituency and socialize in the constituency 24/7, they're going to be more in touch. They're going to be able to, I think, guide policy in a way which is more relevant. And that's what I mean by, participatory democracy in terms of the Labour Party. But I think it's something that we can apply really across the piece, really. And some local authorities have experimented with participatory budgeting. We've seen examples of it in Latin America as well, where you give people the opportunity to have a much greater influence over the decisions that affect their lives. It's not that, you engage in democracy one day out of every 4 or 5 years, or you may have more engagement in the run up to that, let's say a few weeks out of every 4 or 5 years. But you actually, in terms of exerting any power to go and cast your ballot in the polling station, you just get that opportunity once every 4 or 5 years in terms of national politics anyway. And I think this is about engaging with people on an ongoing basis. And I think that would make for much better democracy, much better decision-making. And as I say, as far as those of us that believe in common sense socialism, I think it would put us in a far stronger position to, deliver the kind of socialist transformation that this country is desperately crying out for. And that's not just me saying that. All the polls indicate that the kind of policy agenda that Jeremy Corbyn was advocating is overwhelmingly popular with the vast majority of the British people, including in leafy Tory suburbs. And I remember there was a piece that Giles Brandreth did for the Daily Politics, the BBC Politics programme, where he was going around Guildford, the capital of the home counties, looking for secret socialists. And this was not long after Jeremy Corbyn had been elected the leader of the Labour Party. And he was asking people, stopping him in the street, asking him on various policies around bringing the railways back into public ownership, scrapping tuition fees and tackling the housing crisis, regulating rents and things like that. Kicking the privateers out of the NHS, I think, was another. He didn't quite put it in that way, but those are the sorts of questions that he was putting to people. And universally, they came back and said, yes, that's very sensible. We absolutely support that. And he had a clipboard. On one side, he'd got his questions. On the other side, he got a picture of Jeremy Corbyn. And it was then, at the end of the conversation with each person he stopped and spoke to, he said, well, you're obviously a secret socialist. These are the policies of Jeremy Corbyn. And, he turned the clipboard around. There was a picture of Jeremy. Now, some people recoiled because obviously Jeremy had been demonized by the media. But it just shows you, though, that there is support for the programme. And I think if we had a participatory democratic system in this country, then I think those policies, it would be much easier to bring those policies to fruition. So that's what I'm talking about. Calling into question the failings of representative democracy and demanding, frankly, that for a democracy to work, people need to be given a much greater influence over the decisions that affect their lives.
What would it look like, a participatory system at the Westminster level? What would be going on in Westminster?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's a range of different models, isn't there, or a range of different iterations in that sense. And, in terms of the detail of that, that's something that would need to be worked out. But I think, before, decisions could be made and, when governments publish green papers and white papers and so on, I think there should be a much wider consultation with the general public. And we could have a system in place where there were meaningful consultations with people up and down the land. When you're talking about making, significant transformations, I mean, I wonder whether some of the huge changes that Thatcher brought about, whether it would have been as easy for her to do that if, they'd had to consult with people, in terms of issues to do with the economy, say a company. And this is interestingly something that was contained in both the 2017 and 2019 Labour Party manifesto, where companies that were looking to sell their business, that the workforce would be given the first right of refusal. Now, one of the things I was arguing was that we need to go further than that. Yes, that's good and a significant and important first step. But if we're serious about bringing about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power, then we've really got to be more proactive, it seems to me, in relation to promoting worker cooperatives. And so rather than simply saying when a company is up for sale, workers should be given the right to buy it out, with support from the state through the National Investment Bank and so on. But when companies are looking to offshore their jobs, because what we've seen is that many companies have up sticks and move their manufacturing operations, for example, overseas. So the jobs or those products have stopped being manufactured. In some circumstances, that is the case, but in many circumstances, it's not. They've just moved them overseas. I mean, the case in point in my home city of Derby a few years ago, when I was still the MP, the Rolls-Royce, and they've just announced more further job losses. But anyway, they announced it's about 3 or 4 years ago now. I think it was about 2,000 or 3,000 job losses for highly skilled design engineers, predominantly around the world.
Yeah.
But most of them, of course, would be located in the UK, and most of them in the UK would be in Derby. But literally within, I think, a week or 10 days, no more than that, there was then a further announcement that there was going to be a huge expansion of their operations in Bangalore. Now, that wouldn't happen if we had in place the sort of system that I'm talking about. And people like James Dyson, who likes to clothe himself in the Union Jack, talk about how patriotic he is, but yet he's moved much of his manufacturing operation to the Far East. Now, if workers were given the right to say, well, actually, no, we would quite like to take over this company, thank you, and we'll keep the jobs here. I just think, you'd have a much more vibrant economy, a much more engaged population, and representatives in parliament and in local authorities that were fit for purpose and were genuinely accountable. And I think it would also probably encourage, new working class leaders, for example, to come through. And I just think we'd have a much more dynamic and much more functioning democracy, and one where people were much more engaged with it. Because let's remember, the biggest cohort in every election are the non-voters. And that's a tragedy in a democracy where, none of the above win every election.
The MMT solution to this thing that you're talking about, Chris, which I've heard another guest that we've had on a couple of times, John T. Harvey, is a professor of economics. He calls it the fundamental flaw in capitalism, that, labor is a cost to business. And therefore, if we can get the same workforce, but they're in another country, so they'll work relatively cheaper, we do that because that's capitalism, that's business. We have to generate efficiencies or we're going to get out-competed by comparable business in the same country and we'll go out of business anyway. The way John talks about it is, so that's a fundamental flaw in capitalism. And of course, the MMT solution to that is the job guarantee. Professor John T. Harvey talks about markets as a tool. They're not the be-all and end-all. They shouldn't be the whole thing in an economy. It's just one tool. As it generates these efficiencies, it creates what gets called externalities, unemployment, like Derby, a whole area now, unemployment just shoots up. And of course, the MMT prescription is, okay, private firms, they're going to do what they're going to do, but we can at least, as on the government side, guarantee a minimum standard of living for anybody, whether they're in work or out of work, by a job guarantee or what used to get called employer of last resort. What are your feelings about that?
No, I think that's an important tool in the locker, but I think it needs to be complemented by a commitment to changing the balance of ownership in the economy, as well as along the lines that I've already mentioned. Because I know some critics argue that MMT is just about propping up capitalism. I don't see it that way. I mean, yes, I guess a right-wing government that embraced MMT, could use it in that way, but it doesn't have to be used in that way. And I think certainly a job guarantee scheme is an important component. It's something that the TUC now, for example, are calling for as well, which is encouraging to see that they are talking in those terms. And I do think we need to press this. And I think we also need to be very clear that any job guarantee, in terms of the remuneration, it would be at a level which enabled people to fully participate in society. Not about some sort of kind of cheap labor scheme where people getting a low minimum wage. It would, in my opinion anyway, have to be a significant salary to allow people to fully participate in society. And, clearly there's plenty of things that need to be done. I mean, we look around in my hometown of Derby and all over the country, you see the level of dilapidation, the need for infrastructure improvements, the transport links are dire. I mean, and that clearly needs to be addressed. And the social care, the parks, many local authorities probably all of them actually have closed most of their public toilets and things like that. I mean, some people sometimes think this is an amusing issue, but I remember running a campaign in Derby some years ago when I was the leader of the Labour group and we'd lost control of the council, predominantly down to Gordon Brown's popularity at the time in 2008. But the incoming administration decided they were going to bring forward a proposition that officers had actually put to us to close down all of the council's public conveniences in the city. And we didn't go ahead with that because we recognised that this was actually disadvantaging many people. There was an article that one of the colleagues on the cabinet had read that had said that the regeneration that we were seeing around the country in towns and cities was great, but it was excluding many older and disabled citizens because of the absence of public lavatories. I'm going on a little bit at length of that, but I mean, it's things like that, back in the day when I was a kid, you used to have toilet attendants and so on. I mean, I'm not saying, that's what the job guarantee scheme should be all about, but that's just one element to it. Park keepers, as I've already mentioned, the infrastructure improvements that are required, social care, youth work, etc. These are all crucially important areas of activity. Should carry, a decent remuneration, and we should be promoting it. And we shouldn't, in an economy like Britain, in a wealthy country like Britain, be tolerating any unemployment. Anybody who wants to work should be given the right to work, should have the dignity of work, but it shouldn't be exploitative work. And I wouldn't want to see a system put in place that allowed people to be exploited in that way. And so, yes, I do see there is a role for the job guarantee. I think the TUC scheme was talking about offering jobs for, I think it was a minimum of 3 or 6 months or something. I can't just remember.
I don't think that's ambitious enough.
No, I was just about to say, I think we could be more ambitious. And I think, somebody, for example, got an employment under a job guarantee scheme, they could maybe stay in that. I mean, why would they have to move if they were doing something which they felt was worthwhile, was stimulating, was interesting? Then that's great. I mean, there should be. I wouldn't want to see a kind of end limit to it. I just think it should be there. And if people want to carry on with that, then great. It's an important component of a good society, of a decent society, to have a scheme like that in place.
So I have to say I completely agree with you, Christian. This issue about wages being a cost to companies, I think MMT academics might say that wages are both a cost and an income. You could still have a job guarantee and still undermine the economy by allowing this to happen, and I think that happens mostly when companies think in individualistic terms, but whenever all the companies do it, then it becomes overall damaging. In terms of the job guarantee, I think that's an essential part. I agree with you, Chris, that we need something more of a complete reorganization of the economy and what we allow businesses to do, if anything at all. And people do say that MMT props up capitalism, I guess, because a lot of the proposals coming up right now are to try and address the problems that we are facing right now. But, MMT has also been accused of being a communist plot,
Well, it depends how you want to use this, isn't it? I mean, we've said right-wingers could employ or use the lens of MMT to deliver their program just as, socialists could. And I just think the opportunities it offers to socialists are immense. The truth is that, workers are the wealth creators, and, there is a surplus value that workers generate. And the job guarantee, if it was set at a proper level, as I would want to see it being set, and this is obviously would require, a progressive socialist government to ensure that it was, because obviously a right-wing government that maybe embraced it might want to use it as a way of, potentially depressing wages, perhaps. I don't know. But I mean, I think it could be used in the other way. Because as we know, workers are the wealth creators, and in those private companies, I mean, workers are paid a certain level, but they perhaps work for, 2-3 hours a day maybe, and the rest of the time, they're just generating value for the company and generating profits for the company. And this is why I think, coming back to the point I was making about changing the balance and promoting worker cooperatives in that sense, would help to move that balance in the direction of the majority of people, for the many, if you like, not the few. And, worker cooperatives are not some sort of fluffy lefty idea that, wouldn't really work in practice, because we know that there are some wonderful examples around the world. And one of the most significant ones, of course, is Mondragon in Spain, that was established by a Catholic priest and half a dozen other people. It gives me hope that the movement that we're trying to create could potentially replicate some of that. And so the story goes, the Catholic priest said, look, if we wait for some rich industrialist or the government to create jobs for us, we're all going to die of old age. This was in the Basque region. This was at the height of Francoism. And now Mondragon is, I think it's the 6th or 7th biggest corporation in Spain. It's a significant player anyway, with 100,000 people employed in it. And this is the sort of thing I think that, we should be try and achieve if we can as a grassroots movement. But, if we could get a government that was committed to that, we could make so much more progress, so much more rapidly with all the instruments of the state at your disposal to, bring about this transformation.
Before we talk a bit more about that, I just wanted to make this point that I think it's very easy to go, what we need to do is dismantle capitalism. And then anything that's not dismantling capitalism, whatever your plan is, MMT or anything else, you can then go, oh, well, this is just propping up capitalism. And I think that's what's going on. And that's what happened in the debate the other night. We're just, you're accepting capitalism. And it's like, well, not really. We are actually trying to rewrite the rules of capitalism by going, okay, look, your living standard in this so-called capitalist system, that's what it gets called, who knows what it is now, but your living standard will never fall below this level because, it's now set by the entity that should set it, which is the government. Anything else that's not that is going to be, well, yeah, you're going to be worth what the market thinks you're worth, and the market is constantly trying to make you worth less because labor is a cost to business to be minimized.
Of course.
Looking at it from the individual business point of view, Obviously, looking at it from the macro point of view, like you said, Patricia, it's a cost to an individual business, but when the incomes of those workers goes up, their spending goes up, and therefore it is a benefit to businesses as well. But, that's not
how they think. Yeah, that's not how they think.
Exactly. The way we've set the rules of the game up, compete or get out-competed, then they are going to, try and minimize that cost.
I don't have much time for those, though, that argue that MMT, it's all about propping up capitalism.
Ditto. Yeah.
To me, that's just a cop-out.
Yeah.
I mean, look, we're not in an ideal place. We're on we're on a journey. There's a destination we want to get to, and we have to take some steps along the road. And when I was leader of the council in Derby, I coined a phrase about innovative pragmatism. And whilst for much of that time, the new Labour administration were in government and they were promoting things like private finance initiative, etc. Before I became leader, in fact, I was chair of housing in Derby. I did the first PFI in the city, but we tried to bend it to reflect our local priorities. And so we used it to bring, I think it was 150 empty, unfit dwellings in the inner city that were in the private sector back into good use. They were refurbished to a high standard, and they were rented out at low rents. We had to do it in partnership, regrettably, with a housing association, but we were able to bring these properties back into use. They were then rented to local people. We modelled it in such a way that the council's building works department could do the refurbishment work on the project, and we were funding it for many years because at that time we used to get a block grant every year from central government for renovation grants, which were pepper potted around the city. And so we thought, well, a good idea would be if we kind of top sliced a bit of that, we can use that to bring far more properties back into use in one fell swoop. And that's how we'll finance it. It was a project over 25 years or so. Obviously, the block grant ran out before the end of the PFI term, as it were. But that was a kind of thing that we sort of did. It's not because we necessarily supported, we didn't support PFI, but it was the only show in town for a local authority. And I think, when you are faced with this, the reality of the situation there at the minute, and, I think it's important that you try and come forward with ideas and you start out on a journey. And just because you can't get to the destination in one step, it doesn't mean to say that, you're wrong. There are a number of steps along the road. And the truth is, if Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government had been elected in 2017 or 2019, we would still be a capitalist country. I mean, yes, there would be a lot more public ownership. There would be many more worker cooperatives. That would certainly be a policy direction. But we're not going to kind of sweep away, capitalism in one fell swoop. So I think those that are kind of criticising MMT in that way are just being incredibly unfair and unrealistic. That's my opinion anyway.
Jeremy Corbyn was propping up capitalism.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's what someone would argue. I mean, it's just absurd. If you're interested in realpolitik, then you've got to get your hands dirty a little bit, really. But and as I say, we're on a journey, and let's we know where we're heading, and there are certain steps we have to take along the way. But I think MMT is a huge opportunity. It really is, and it's not. I don't think anyway, as I've already said, a hugely complex concept to get your head around. And so the more people we can expose it to, the better, really. What's depressing, of course, is that our parliamentarians, sort of media commentators, they're not sort of putting this out there. And so, not enough people in the wider general public are being given the opportunity to consider it for themselves and to make their own mind up, come to their own view about it.
So why is that?
Well, I mean, I suppose...
Do they know about it? I assume they do know about it.
Well... you'd be surprised at the level of ignorance in Parliament. When I got there in 2010, I was in awe of the place a little bit. I remember reading Nye Bevan's book, In Place of Fear, when he talked about feeling in a similar experience about somebody coming from a humble background. I think he said that the great splendor of the Palace of Westminster and the figures, these great figures that adorn the walls, all this kind of heritage, etc., can have the effect of cowing somebody from humble origins. But he goes on to then remind us that we have to remember that they're venerating people who have absolutely nothing to do with our class. They are the characters who kept our ancestors under the heel, ruthlessly exploited the working class. And that's certainly something that I think is really important to hold true to when, you find yourself, like I did, coming from this kind of humble background. But I got there thinking, these people, brains the size of planets, these were hugely intellectual and clever people. And here was I, an ex-bricklayer, What was I doing there in that sense? But then you kind of start working with them, and yeah, I mean, the level of ignorance on some of these concepts is quite shocking, really. And so I think there's a big job for us to do in getting this message out and keep banging away with it. And I think the more that we can take the message to the wider general public, the more that they can, impress upon their representatives, parliamentarians, and the more that we can get it embedded into political parties, this thinking, then I think, the greater the chance then that people will start to suddenly the penny drop, but they're just labouring under complete misapprehension, frankly. I mean, I remember Jonathan Reynolds writing a piece on Labour List, and when he cited me and my sort of support for MMT, and he went through this diatribe about how, it clearly wouldn't work, and it would create all sorts of difficulties. And, I think he went on about, the pound sterling not being a reserve currency, the MMT would only work in the United States, etc. And there's a complete misunderstanding of it, and I don't think it was necessarily deliberate on his part. But there's a big educative job still to do, but it's certainly gaining ground. It's gaining traction. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I don't think so.
Partly thanks to you.
Well, maybe, but more, I think people like yourselves who've done an incredible job in actually promoting the issue, and as I say, it's getting to a much wider audience. And I think when that light bulb moment happens, there's no going back, in my opinion. And as I said, because it's not an incredibly complicated concept, I don't think it is anyway, then, I really do think that it has massive, massive potential. And the more people, and because it is gaining ground now, and I think Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez did a wonderful job, AOC, in the States in promoting it. But there's obviously a lot more that we need to do, but we're getting there, I think. We're getting there.
Obviously, when you come up against somebody that goes, MMT wouldn't work, it goes back to the thing that Bill Mitchell's always said. It's like,
yes, exactly.
When people say we're going to shift to MMT, you're dealing with somebody that hasn't grasped
exactly,
and probably hasn't read any of the academic literature at all. Yeah. Like Bill Mitchell says, it's a lens. It's not a regime that we're going to switch to. Yeah. There is this policy prescription about a job guarantee in there as well. And
exactly.
all economic schools of thought have a descriptive part and a prescriptive part, but the descriptive part is just that. But before we move on, I was looking on your site and you write about updating the Lucas plan on defence diversification. To my shame, I didn't know what the Lucas plan was until I read that. And it's very in tune with what we've just been talking about. Can you tell the listeners about that?
Yeah, the Lucas plan was a really innovative proposition, and it was really inspiring, I think. And it goes back to 1976, and there were potential job losses at Lucas Aerospace, which was a defence company. And at that time, there were many, many more trade unions, 13 trade unions, in fact. And this was a plan that was devised by the Shop Stewards Combine. This was done by shop floor workers, actually, led by the senior shop steward, Mike Cooley. And what they wanted to do was, because they were facing potential job losses, and so they put their heads together and worked out a plan to say, look, can we not use our skills to diversify away from defence and into socially useful products so that we can, keep these jobs and we can retain these high-tech skills, as it were. And they came forward, I think it was 150 socially useful products. And this is going back to 1976. But I was really struck by the fact that back then they were talking about using their skills and taking the opportunity to promote renewable energy. They said that we could build wind turbines, we could utilize solar energy, we could build hybrid vehicles, we could expand and develop combined heat and power programs, and many other projects like that. But just those four, when you think back, 44 years ago, they were talking about that. And this was before there was widespread awareness about climate change. And, if only the company had taken it on board, but of course, that wasn't how things worked. And so when they put these propositions to the board, they threw them out. And they had no support from the government. I mean, Tony Benn encouraged them. Tony Benn was initially the industry minister, and then after the referendum in 75, he got moved to energy. But he was very supportive. But there was no government support directly for the Lucas Shop Stewards Combine. They did it themselves. In fact, there wasn't any support. I spoke to some of the had the privilege of meeting some of the shop stewards who were actually involved in the Lucas plan, and they said that they had no support from the trade union bureaucracy either. In fact, quite the contrary, they were met with barriers by the trade union bureaucrats at the time. I mean, nothing changes much, does it, really, in many ways, I guess. But yeah, so that's the type of thing, really. I think that, and this again, comes back to the discussion we were having a bit earlier, really, about, involving people more, involving workers, involving citizens in decisions that affect their life, involving workers in decisions that affect their lives. They could come forward with incredibly innovative and novel ideas. And I'm reliably informed, although I've not checked on every single one, but I am reliably informed by people who've looked into this very deeply that of the 150 products that they suggested, all of them have been subsequently brought to market, but not in this country, ironically.
As an engineer, it just resonates with me so much, this Lucas plan. But I have to say, engineers they're not very familiar with the concept of unionizing. So this would be a really nice step up, but they are very socially conscious. So I, absolutely love it.
You'll have to start the union then.
I know. It'll have to start with me, I'm afraid.
Well, that's it. It is bottom-up organising is what we're talking about, basically. Yeah. Those people in the factory back in 74, Chris, that you're talking about, they saw what was coming. And instead of going, we demand you protect our jobs, they were going, we demand you make better stuff. We know what the world needs. I think it's very powerful.
And if you give workers the ability, if you give workers their head in that sense, if you give citizens their head, if you involve people, as I say, you create a more dynamic democracy, you create a more dynamic industry. Everybody's a winner, it seems to me. And of course, we need to do more to help communities, to help people to grow as people. I mean, there's far too much emphasis around work, really. We should be working far fewer hours than we are. We should be able to be focused more on, on education, on community, in a way that, many people find very, very difficult, if not impossible. And even though when I was a kid growing up in the 1960s, I was told to get ready for the leisure generation, because by the 1990s or early 2000s, we'll only be working 15 hours a week. I mean, what happened to that? Well, what happened to that was that Thatcher got elected in 1979 and we had neoliberalism inflicted upon us, and that just sort of got thrown in the dustbin. But, in the 60s and 70s, local authorities were being urged to build leisure centres and swimming pools and golf courses and tennis courts, etc., to ensure that the oncoming leisure generation would have, activities that they could do, and the local authorities could play their part in providing, facilities and so on. I mean, adult education was a big thing. The Workers' Education Association got a lot of resources and funding from local authorities, and the Open University, which is a great innovation of the Wilson government, 64 to 70 Wilson government, which gave opportunities for higher education for working class people who not had the opportunity of going into higher education. And that anecdote that I often recount about Tony Benn talking about the need to raise the school leaving age to 75 because he was so committed to lifelong learning, and then recounting the tale of receiving a letter a couple of weeks or so after he'd made a speech where he'd made that point from an 85-year-old disgruntled pensioner who'd said, "Why are you discriminating against me, Mr. Benn? I've just graduated from the Open University," at which point he changed his position and said there should be no upper age limit. But that's the kind of society that we should be creating, where, yes, everybody's got the opportunity to have a decent job that's fulfilling, that is rewarding, that provides the resources they need to, play a full part in society. But there's opportunities to, grow as individuals, to grow as human beings, to, as it were, spend time with your family, to go in and out of education, if you wish, to enjoy kind of leisure pursuits and so on. I mean, look, this is not pie in the sky. It might sound pie in the sky given where we are now, but with political will and commitment, we can make it happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's enough reasons in the world, in Britain and around the world, to ensure everybody has a decent life. But, sadly, we've been focused on profit, on war. The military-industrial complex is so influential. The corruption that goes on, the ability of wealthy, powerful lobbyists, the role of the media. I mean, the odds are stacked against us, but, what they haven't got, I mean, and, the Percy Shelley poem, that The Mask of Anarchy, where he concludes it by saying, "We are many, they are few." And that's absolutely the case. And I think if we can, mobilize people, we can give people confidence and inspire people to make the change, then the change will be brought about. But people need to feel empowered, because I think so many people feel disempowered. And of course, the establishment want that. They want people to kind of give up on politics. They want people to think nothing can change, so they can do nothing. They're helpless. But when we stand together, when people stand in unison, then there's nothing that can beat us. But it's just getting to that place. And this is why it's a big ask. I'm not saying, we're going to be able to deliver any or all of this in terms of the grassroots movement that we're trying to create, this festival of resistance that we've talked about, this resistance movement. That's the type of thing that we're hoping to try and do, to inspire people, to encourage people, to raise expectations, to raise political consciousness. And actually, when the festival, the physical festival of resistance, the weekend festival that we are planning takes place, we've got speakers from around the world who will be in attendance, but also recording videos as well. But we do have a commitment from people involved in the Yellow Vest movement in France, the Gilets Jaunes, who have been incredibly inspirational. Amazing. I mean, and of course, there's been almost a virtual media blackout in this country in terms of, what they were doing. But until the pandemic and the lockdown, I mean, they were out on the street every single weekend for over a year, challenging and opposing Macron's reforms. And it was amazing how they brought the communities together, brought workers together. It was wonderful. There were some brilliant examples where the Philharmonic Orchestra playing to a big rally demonstration. The ballet company were performing as well. It was brilliant. A real kind of sense of community, social solidarity. And that's the type of thing that we're hoping that we can bring about, and recognize the importance of street protest alongside some of these other practical things that we can do, like maybe creating a Mondragon style worker cooperative with local chapters all over the country, bring about a community-based financial institution, whether it be a credit union or a community bank that could be beneficial to people, community art, community radio platforms, and so on. There's many, many things I think that we can do, outside of the party political structure that can make a practical difference and really empower people. And hopefully that will encourage people, new working class leaders to come through, and giving people the tools and the information to challenge the politicians, to challenge the status quo, MMT being a really, in my opinion, crucial component of that. But there's many things as well at a local level that local authorities could and should be doing. And we need to empower people with the information to challenge their local authorities, to challenge their local councillors, to say, you have the powers at your disposal right now, even with all the cuts that the Tories have imposed, thanks to another piece of Tory legislation, to bring about a redistributive council tax budget, where you instruct, you demand that the rich people in the borough pay the lion's share, and you freeze or even reduce, depending on how many big mansions you've got in each local authority area. And this will vary from one local authority to another, and it won't work as well in some local authorities as it will in others. But there is an opportunity, a potential for local councillors to stop the Tory cuts and to embark upon some growth in the local area. And that could be done in consultation with the local community. There would be a requirement to go to a referendum. That's another piece of Tory legislation that was brought in, but there's nothing wrong with that, because it would then force, if any local authority were to embrace this, it would force them then to engage with the public. It'd be an example, in a way, of participatory democracy, to say, well, look, here's an opportunity for us to stop the cuts, and we're going to ask the rich people to pay. We're going to protect you. And where do you think we should be putting the growth? What should we be spending the surplus resources that we can generate through that? And then another area that local authorities should be doing but are not doing, and again has been ironically been made possible by the Tories. We've been banging on for years, and it was never happened under the new Labour regime either for 13 years, to lift the debt cap on the housing revenue account. There should be a massive council house building program now. There's nothing to stop them doing it, short of the resources, the skilled labour and the land availability, which is potentially a problem in some London boroughs. But for most local authorities, they have land availability. They may have skill shortages, but then they should embark upon training courses, for people. So that's the kind of thing I think that we're looking to try and bring about. As I say, this need to raise consciousness, to raise expectations, and encourage people to demand more from the people that are supposed to be representing them. They're not doing a very good job of it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The representatives, that is.
So, and, one of the ways they make us feel helpless and disempowered, the establishment, is by telling us that, sorry, we've run out of money. Whether it's at the national level,
yes, exactly.
or if we follow through on your proposal to do this and this and this, that will, quote unquote, bankrupt the country.
Absolutely.
On your Festival of Resistance site, you write, we will push for an ambitious Green New Deal. This should be funded through a different economic prospectus that understands the opportunities afforded to a country like the UK with its own sovereign currency. Obviously, that's music to our ears as MMT is. And then you go on to write, we will call for overt monetary financing to be utilised instead of automatically resorting to the use of government bonds, which really amount to corporate welfare. So just in case there are any people listening who are new to all this stuff, they're on the same page as us in terms of the outcomes that we want, but they're new to all this nuts and bolts monetary operations stuff. Can you unpack that paragraph for those people, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm talking about there, that's clearly on a national scale. At a local level, I mean, local authorities are constrained in a way in which, national governments are not. But because in the sense that Britain, pound sterling, we have our own currency. That's one good thing that Gordon Brown did do. He kept us out of the Eurozone. But that gives the ability to the British government, because it's a currency issuer, as it were. No other entity anywhere in the world is allowed to issue pound sterling. So we can never, ever run out of money. And the only barrier to economic growth is the availability of resources in the land. And we know that there are plenty of spare resources. And so what I'm arguing for there, and we need an ambitious Green New Deal, and we need to make sure that we're using the right technologies, because there's a lot of greenwash going around now at the moment, and projects which, for example, portray themselves as environmentally friendly, when you unpick it, you realize that actually they're causing as much damage as the sort of technologies, the fossil fuel technology that they're allegedly replacing. And that's something that we need to be, to guard against. But clearly there is a big investment requirement there for that, as there is, for improving infrastructure and so on. And this is where often you hear this notion that, it's just, are you going to pay for it? It's bankrupt the nation, as you were saying. But because we're a currency issuing government, we can just, issue the fund. We can create the finance, we can create the currency to actually meet the need to address climate change and the other policy priorities that we have. But rather than, which is often the way of selling government bonds to corporations and rich individuals, for which they receive a guaranteed return on their investment, you could engage in something which is called overt monetary financing, where rather than as it were, selling bonds, you simply use the currency that you can create, as it were, that the government's responsible for issuing in that sense, to spend it directly on whatever it might be that you want to do, in terms of the Green New Deal or the other infrastructure improvements that you want to make, and public services improvements that you want to deliver, schools and healthcare system, etc. And we should be striving for, public excellence. I think George Monbiot talks about public excellence and private sufficiency, and that's absolutely where we should be driving towards, in my opinion. And I think MMT gives us the opportunity to do that. So say it's a kind of a common sense, sensible understanding of the monetary system, a recognition of the flexibilities that are available to a government like Britain that can never run out of money, ever. A country like Britain, where we know there is lots and lots of spare capacity. We know that there's far too many people still unemployed. Much of the unemployment, of course, is hidden. But what we also know is that some people may be employed, but many people are underemployed as well. And then, of course, if we put it in the context, as I was saying earlier on, about reducing the working week substantially, then, pulling all these things together, we can bring about that good society. We can use the fact that Britain is a very powerful economy with its own sovereign currency to make all these changes that desperately need to be made. It ain't complicated, I don't think, anyway, and I may not have explained it as well as some people can. But I honestly think it is a huge opportunity that socialists absolutely should be embracing and promoting it and using it to argue for and demand the changes that we need to bring about. And, the smart-ass commentators who often put that question, particularly when you're focusing on raising the finance for the program that you want to implement from taxes, they always say, where the money going to come from, and if it's not going to be from taxes, where you're going to make the cuts. Well, you don't need to get in. That's just a trap. You don't need to go down that road. You kind of just school them in an understanding of how the monetary system operates. These people are clever people. They've been to university, I haven't been to university. I went to Polytechnic, to be fair, when I was in my late 20s to train as a social worker. But this it ain't that complicated, and you wonder whether or not there is a kind of conspiracy of the
maybe there's something
going on here and the establishment to kind of keep people in ignorance. I mean, that's clearly what they certainly benefit from that, and they want to use that to maintain the status quo from which they gain handsomely. But I often ask myself the question, how much money do these characters want? They can't spend the money that they've got now, for God's sake. Surely wouldn't it be better to share it around a bit and use the opportunities that we have in this country to ensure that nobody's in poverty, everybody has a good standard of living, we have a good society, this would be a much more functioning country, wouldn't it? Where the inequality was massively reduced and everyone could play a full part in society. I mean, many of the social problems that we're currently encountering would be eliminated, I think, by doing such a scheme in terms of the way we ordered our economy.
I do have a question, actually, which is sort of related to something that we spoke earlier. You seem to be the odd one out, Chris, in terms of, the penny dropped really fast and you accepted it fully and wholeheartedly from the beginning. And it was your head, it was like so receptive to it. But often some of the kind of, we've touched upon one of them, the kind of propping up capitalism thing. The rejection that we get from the sides of the left often are more related to ideology, even though it shouldn't, but also to the notion that if we say that taxes don't fund spending, then how are we going to justify taxing the rich? And I don't understand why it's so hard for so many people to let go of that and to think, well, maybe there are other ways in which we can either justify taxing the rich or tackle inequality. And I was wondering what your insights were as to, why could you see through that and why do others get so stuck in that line?
Well, I don't know. There's none so blind as those that refuse to see, I suppose. And there, this kind of consensus that has built up over the last 40 odd years, it's very difficult to break out of, I suppose. It's kind of drummed into people in universities. It's something which is trotted out every day by the media commentators, by the newspapers, the political elites in society. It's something that they've all bought into and embraced. And I don't know. I guess they find it difficult to think outside the box, really, and that's why it's important that a few of us kind of kick over the traces a bit, really, and try and mix it up a wee bit. I mean, there are some great people out there who are doing some of that. I mean, and Richard Murphy, who I'd hoped would be brought in to work with the Shadow Treasury team. He was working closely with Jeremy Corbyn in the first leadership contest in 2015. I think it was his insights that led to the phrase being coined about Corbynomics. And I think had they got Richard in, I think, some of his thinking on this would have had a big impact and might have just about, enabled us to kind of cut through, as it were. But it seemed that they kind of, one of the things that Jonathan Reynolds was going on about was, we're taking advice from Nobel Prize winning economists as if somehow that makes them infallible. Well, I mean, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman were the Nobel Prize winners, for goodness sake, and their perspective has been an absolute disaster. Disaster.
The Nobel Prize thing comes up a lot on this podcast, so we're just gonna have to insert it again that it's not a real Nobel Prize. It's the Swedish Banker Prize. So it's the tribute act to the Nobel Prize.
But interestingly as well, of course, I mean, back in the day, the Mont Pelerin Society was created, was it in about 1947, because the kind of, neoliberal sort of thinking was seen as so kind of far out and absurd and ridiculous that they kind of almost created this secret society, as I understand it. And I think they were kind of in despair, really, at the prospect of ever being able to have any influence over, government thinking around the world. Keynesian was dominant at that point in time. But it just shows that things can turn around. And, that kind of post-war consensus did stand the test of time. There were a number of things wrong with it, of course, and not least of which they were able to overturn it ultimately. And I think what I'm interested in is bringing about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in that sense. But, it lasted 34 years. But this situation that we're living through at the moment, I mean, that's gone on even longer, hasn't it? I mean, from 79 to today, we're talking 41 years. So it's time for a shift. It's certainly time for the pendulum to move. And it was a bit disappointing. I think, there's some good stuff, absolutely, in the Labour manifesto. But it was disappointing that John didn't seem prepared to embrace MMT. I did actually talk to him about it. I did try to encourage him to meet Stephanie Kelton. In fact, Stephanie was on a lecture tour and she was speaking at the UCL and offered to take a bit of time out to come and meet John, but he found a reason why he wasn't available to do so. I know Bill Mitchell met with him as well, but John was, he's influenced by these, orthodox economic advisors who couldn't see the wood for the trees, it seems to me.
It's a little bit heartbreaking for us, really.
I love the appointment of John McDonnell because I saw his history of, taking it to the city. And he was one of the few MPs who consistently voted against the city, the law structure and the ever-reaching powers. And suddenly when he comes into the game, he becomes, more wanting to please the city or more wanting to appease the city.
Yeah, John took a rather kind of curious position when I spoke to him about MMT. And I wasn't, totally across it then. I wouldn't say I'm totally across it now either. But I mean, I feel a bit more confident about it than perhaps I was at that point in time. But his view was that MMT wouldn't work in the UK because pound sterling wasn't a reserve currency. It would only work in the States because, the dollar is an, international kind of currency in that sense,
Half an hour with Stephanie Kelton would have sorted that out.
Well, I know, mate, but yeah, exactly. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it is a depressing thing. I mean, John made a great line in the 2017 campaign where he talked about the Tory manifesto and, he said, look, we've carefully costed our manifesto, we've explained where we're going to raise the money from, blah, 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 blah. I mean, frankly, at that point in time, I was kind of buying into all that stuff then too. But he said the only numbers in the Tory manifesto were the page numbers. And it was a funny line. It was a good line. But he completely missed the point, didn't it? About the monetary system, how it works, and I think it will be so liberating for, somebody like John or whoever. I can't see it happening, frankly, now, sadly, within the Labour Party. But it would have been so liberating to see a shadow chancellor just smash these commentators out of the park when they come up with these bullshit kind of propositions. I wished I'd been given the opportunity to have done. I mean, when I did get the chance, I did sort of try to do so, but obviously I wasn't on the front bench by that time, and certainly wasn't a Treasury spokesperson. But oh my God, you could have had great sport, couldn't you, with them? Because it would have just floored them, taking the wind out of the sails, immediately.
You would have been the most economic savvy person on TV, Chris, as well as in Parliament.
So, in short, in the immediate term, we're not going to see this paradigm shift in mainstream politics in the immediate term, but we can see it in the Festival of Resistance. Just to read the website, the Festival of Resistance will be organising community events aimed at demystifying economics, to empower people to challenge the establishment narrative that there is no alternative. Are there any events in the diary apart from the actual festival, online events or anything like that, Chris?
Well, we're doing an online video broadcast every week, actually, on a range of different topics, to be honest with you. We've interviewed a range of different people. Patricia, I think you've been on, and I think it was one of my colleagues, Sean Bloor.
So interviewed you. All the best people.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're putting stuff out like that. But what
the
we
only
really
one available.
What we really want to do, and clearly there is an opportunity using the online platforms, and that's something I think which this lockdown has exposed a lot of people to, and I think upskilled so many people now, hundreds of thousands, millions of people potentially, and I think it will have an application when we get through this, whenever that happens. And so what we plan to do is have a kind of roadshow, and we'll be talking about a range of these different topics on a range of different issues. It'll be a range of different topics, but one of them is absolutely got to be, in my opinion, this point that you were just reading, I think, from the website there about demystifying economics. That's got to be a key and important part of that, and taking kind of economics, if you like, to the people. And John started down this road a bit, except he was still constrained by the whole kind of tax suspend notion. And Momentum were doing some good work on this, but sadly they went awry as well. But this notion of we're bringing people from the wider general public, as it were, or people in the movement to talk about these concepts, was a great idea. But they didn't keep going with that, which was a real pity. But that is something that once the lockdown is over, and we can start organising events, we absolutely want to do that, because the few of us that have got this, me, and others, I will say few. I mean, it is increasing in numbers, but we have to empower the grassroots. We have to empower citizens, if you like, give them the tools to be able to argue the case. And to this, coming back to this point about raising expectations and raising political consciousness. I mean, as Henry Ford once said, that, if people understood, I'm paraphrasing because I haven't got the quote directly in front of me, but essentially he was saying if people understood the banking and monetary system, there'd be a revolution before tomorrow morning. And, I think this is such a kind of an empowering proposition. And, MMT is the key to that, in my view. It's kind of revolutionary. It's there. I mean, it's not like, as you said, it's not a kind of an ideology over here, but it's that kind of understanding which is revolutionary, I think.
Just like understanding capitalism, that Marx brought people was revolutionary in a sense.
Absolutely.
The other thing I wanted to say was that you did a really good job at the debate on Monday representing MMT. I know you consider yourself a layman for MMT terms, but you're definitely up there.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I did feel slightly exposed, as it were, speaking in that capacity, because I thought, oh my goodness me, it's all kind of riding on me in this debate, and I'm up against like a fully fledged economist, and I'm just an ex-bricklayer, So it did feel a bit odd, in that sense. So I'm pleased you didn't feel I let the side down too much.
No, it went really well, and you've got a really good grasp of it, in my opinion.
Yeah, good. Well, that's encouraging to know. But the key thing is, though, we've got to spread this.
Yeah.
We want, hundreds of thousands, millions of people to kind of get this. And as I say, I don't think it's too complicated a concept for that to be an unrealistic proposition. It's a concept which is more readily accessible, I think, than neoclassical endogenous growth theory, for example. So, I think there's huge opportunity, and hopefully there'll be light bulbs, switching on all over the country as we spread this information around, and hopefully people like yourselves might help us and join us in some of the roadshow meetings that we will organise to actually, engage with people and to go about trying to demystify this whole issue around the way in which the monetary system operates, because that, knowledge is power. And if we can empower people in that way, I think we can really bring about big changes. And those changes can happen swiftly. We can make change happen. It doesn't have to be a gradual process. It doesn't have to be a long slog. It's just something that, we can be those agents of that change. And MMT can be, the agent of that change too.
Well, that sounds like a great place to leave it. Thanks for all your time that you've given us, Chris.
No, it's a privilege.
All right. Well, it's been great to talk to you.
All right, mate. All the best. Thanks for inviting us. I really appreciate it. It's a real honour and a privilege to be invited onto such an esteemed podcast as yourself. So, and I mean that honestly. It does, particularly for somebody like me. It feels really, quite a privilege to be asked to speak on something like this. So, thank you for doing that.
First of many, I hope.
Best of luck.
You too, Chris.
Have a good evening.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, look after yourself. Cheers, Christian. Bye, Patricia. Cheers, mate. Bye-bye now. Bye, thanks.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Editing and post-production was by Damien Caldwell. Thanks for listening.